I'm Nick Whalen from RotoWire. If you're just getting into fantasy basketball, maybe you're joining a league for the first time, don't worry, we got you. We're going to give you some basic tips to help you have fun and succeed in your fantasy basketball leagues this season. Number one, and this applies to any fantasy sport, any fantasy league you've ever played in, make sure you know your league's settings, scoring settings, roster settings. I know it's basic, but fantasy basketball is much different from fantasy football, where leagues might have some minor scoring variants, but for the most part, it's pretty straightforward. In fantasy basketball, scoring formats are more varied. They can really influence the value of certain players. Are you in a head-to-head league? Is it points? Is it categories? Are you in a rotisserie league or a roto league? Make sure you figure that out well in advance of your draft and build your rankings or your cheat sheets accordingly. If you're playing in a points league in fantasy basketball, for the most part, it functions similarly to most fantasy football leagues that you've probably played in. Point values are assigned to each stat category. Maybe it's 1 point for each point scored, 1.2 points for a rebound, 1.5 for an assist, etc. In a head-to-head points league, pretty simple. Like fantasy football, the team that accrues the most points overall wins the matchup. In head-to-head category leagues, however, wins and losses are determined by which team wins the most specific stat categories. Typically, there are 8 or 9 of those categories. So instead of simply ending the week with a win or a loss, you typically tally up the number of categories won, and that goes to your season-long record. So if you win 6 categories and your opponent wins 3, you'd come away from the week with a 6-3 mark. Now, in roto leagues, scoring is again broken down by stat categories, but those stats are accumulated over the course of the season. So let's say you're in a 12-team league. The team with the most rebounds at the end of the season would get 12 points. The team with the third most rebounds would get 10 points. Same goes for the other categories like points, assists, steals, blocks, three-pointers, etc. Roto leagues also typically include percentage categories, so field goal percentage and free throw percentage. There is some strategy going along with those. Someone like Giannis Antetokounmpo, for instance, he gives you elite points, he gives you rebounds, he gives you a great field goal percentage, but he doesn't shoot many threes, and he's a very poor free throw shooter who takes a ton of free throws. So that really kills the free throw percentage category. Roster construction really comes into play in roto leagues. Typically, you want to find as much balance as you can, but if you're rostering someone like Giannis, it can be difficult to try to offset that free throw percentage hole that he puts you in. Number 2, game count is massive. Unlike fantasy football, where teams only play 1 game per week, every team gets 1 bye, the schedule in the NBA is a huge part of fantasy basketball. This is especially true in leagues that use weekly lineups as opposed to daily lineups. In weekly lineup leagues, you set your lineup at the start of the week, typically on Monday, and it carries through the end of the week. So once a player plays his first game, he's locked into your lineup, regardless of whether he gets injured or doesn't play. With the variance in the NBA schedule, it's important to always be on top of how many games each player and each team has in a given week. Well, it might be counterintuitive to sit a star player at any time. If his team only plays, say, 2 games, you may be better off going with a significantly lesser player on a 4-game week. Maximizing that game count is a huge advantage in just about any fantasy basketball format. Number 3, make sure you're aware of team and player context. And this is especially true as you go into your draft. When you enter your draft, it's important to familiarize yourself with the player pool. Maybe run some mock drafts on the RotoWire Draft Kit app. Maybe check out some ADPs over on our ADP comparison page. Just make sure you have a general gauge of where you expect players to go off the board. But make sure you're keeping in mind team context as well. This is especially important in the NBA, which deals with rest and tanking much more than any other major sports league. Be aware of good players on bad teams, guys who could, sure, play well early in the season, but could end up being rested. They could see reduced workloads. They could be traded later in the season. Anybody who's played fantasy basketball has probably been victimized by this at some point. You know, a player who's great early on, but suddenly the All-Star break comes around and he's sitting out back-to-backs. He's seeing reduced minutes, maybe being shelved altogether at the end of the season. It's not easy to predict how the season will play out for each team. We know that, but be wary of some obvious players who you might need to look to sell at some point in the season if their team's season is heading south. Number 4, make sure you're aware of positional eligibility constraints. This is a huge one in fantasy basketball, especially relative to fantasy football, where position eligibility is pretty straightforward. Running backs are running backs, receivers are receivers, tight ends are tight ends. The NBA, you may have heard, is an increasingly positionless league, so they say, but each player is only eligible at certain spots. So in most leagues, you'll need to fill guard, forward, and center spots. Some leagues may even require more specific designations like power forward, small forward, shooting guard, point guard. I wouldn't worry too much about this early in drafts. At that point, I'm drafting more for best player available. I'm trying to, target certain categories as opposed to positions. But as the draft goes on, you don't want to be overweight at a certain position or find yourself scrambling to grab your second center well after pick 100. It's great to have depth, but as is the case in any fantasy league, you don't want to have too many guys at a certain position, as you can only start so many each week. It's great to have all those points on your bench, but if they're not in your lineup, it doesn't really matter. Try to find a balance as much as you can so you're not starting an inferior player just because you have too many better players at a different position and you can't fit all of them in your lineup. Depending on which site you're playing on, position eligibility can vary pretty considerably, but I tend to use players who are multi-position eligible as a tiebreaker. If I'm trying to decide between multiple players, having someone you could plug in at guard and forward or forward and center, it really helps as the season goes along. Injuries pile up. You start riding out the ebbs and flows of the schedule. Having someone you could plug in at guard and forward or forward and center, it really helps as the season goes along. Injuries pile up. You start to understand and ride out the ebbs and flows of the schedule. If you can get those multi-position eligible players, that's something that can really, really help your roster as the year goes along. Our fifth and final point of advice for beginning fantasy basketball managers: just try to balance risk and reward. And I know this is an obvious one. It applies to just about any fantasy draft for any sport. But as the draft goes on, make sure you're striking a balance between reliable veteran assets and some higher upside plays, some speculative ads as the draft moves on, especially in the mid to late rounds. You don't ever want to overexpose yourself to risky assets like rookies, especially rookie guards, who historically tend to be volatile fantasy assets in year one. Field goal percentage, turnovers, general efficiency tend to be issues for even the best rookie guards over the years. So that's something to keep in mind. And make sure you're not overexposing yourself to injury-prone players. In fantasy basketball, injuries are a huge part of the game, especially in those weekly lineup leagues. You may think a player has a 4-game week, but doesn't include a back-to-back. Maybe he could sit out one half of those. Players like Joel Embiid, Paul George, LaMelo Ball, Kawhi Leonard, they're all worth taking at certain points in a draft, but you need to be aware of the risk that you're incurring. If I take any of those players, I want to make sure I have adequate depth behind them, because history strongly suggests that you'll be without them for a decent chunk at some point in the season. And while we're talking balance, if you're in a category-based league, make sure you're aware of which categories you're accumulating as the draft goes along. Ideally, you're building a balanced roster that could compete in all 8 or 9 categories, but that's a lot easier said than done. So if you take, say, 2 big men early on, you're probably going to want to target 3-pointers or assists later in the draft. If you load up on guards early, then blocks and rebounds and field goal percentage would be your next targets. There are certain category specialist players who can help you out later in the draft as well. Think Buddy Hield for threes, Alex Caruso for steals, Clint Capella, or even Andre Drummond for rebounds. These players can help you immensely in one category, but they usually don't provide a whole lot else. But they are players to earmark later in the draft if you really need help in a certain category. All right, that'll do it for our list of basic strategy points to keep in mind if you're just getting into fantasy basketball this season. Highly encourage you to check out all of our content, of course, over at rotowire.com/basketball. We got a ton of pre-draft tools. You can check out our ADP report. You can see all of our custom rankings. You can tailor them to your league-specific scoring and roster settings. Just head on over to rotowire.com/try. It'll get you a free peek behind the paywall. You'll have access to all the tools, all the content on our site, rotowire.com/try.